Hey, welcome to Awesome Movie Year. We got a special bonus right now, as alluded to on our Punk in London episode. Here's my interview with Skip King, ML Compton, my experts in punk music, and guys who really illuminate more about the movie and the scene than we ever could. All right, welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. We have two very special guests with us right now. You guys, if I was starting a garage band, these would be two of the first phone calls I would make. Besides being involved in the punk music scene for decades, I don't think I know anybody who knows more about punk music than these two gentlemen. My favorite foodie couple in Las Vegas. It's ML Compton and Skip King. How are you guys?
Doing great.
So we picked Punk in London. I picked it for this season because I'm a huge fan of the genre. I think punk music, movie-wise, there are some ups and downs. I've never seen this one. I'm a huge Clash fan. That's pretty much really what I got into it, why I picked this film. But I know you guys made it, ML, you made it over to kind of England in 1979. Was this movie really focused on 77. What was the difference or similarity in the scene when you got there?
Well, mostly by 79, the punk scene was beginning to die out. There were still plenty of punk bands. I was there for 5 weeks and I went and saw bands every night I was there. And there were plenty of bands playing, but it was mostly turning into what the unfortunate term post-punk, which I'm not a big fan of, but that's what everybody calls it. And, those type of bands are beginning to show up more and more. Bands like Magazine and the pop group, I saw both of them when I was over there.
And Joy Division.
Joy Division. I saw Joy Division when I was over there, yeah. I consider them punk bands, but not everybody does.
Right. In the film, they were already using the term new wave in like 77. And Skip, I think, adding on to ML's point, like some of the more interesting stuff in the interviews were when different, punk rockers were talking about how the scene was already dying in 77, which, not being alive back then, but being a punk fan, that's what I consider to be like the height of the scene, right?
Well, as I turned to him during the movie and they talked about the 100 Club, I said, didn't it close officially December 31st, 1976? I think that might have been the very last night that the 100 Club actually had bands. So 76 was really the birth of it. And already by 77, people they were like the group, the roadie for the Clash, Rodent, talks about the fact, there's only 2 bands left that don't mean anything. Everybody else is copying us. That's not a factual statement, but in reality, they were the 2 most important bands to the rest of the world. And it was beginning to be a rest of the world situation and not just their own little homegrown laboratory of their bands. So when people think back at then, who were lived back then, think about it, they're like, they're so over now because everybody's finding out about them, essentially.
Right.
It really wasn't over, though, because there was plenty of stuff going on in 77 going forward.
It seemed like as it heightened, that kind of everything they were fighting against, right, became part of the machine, where now we have bigger record labels and, we're making it a little more palatable. So even as punk got bigger, maybe as some of the kind of subjects were saying, the ideals and the birth of the movement had kind of started to die off by that point.
Yeah. It's interesting because, to me, punk never completely died. It changed. It needed to. I mean, my definition of punk is totally different than what other people's definition is. But, basically, I think punk was an attitude and not a sound. Nowadays, it's considered a sound. It's all the fast 1, 2, 3, 4 bands that call themselves punks, and everybody else is post-punk. But one thing when you were just talking there, the one thing I started thinking about was that I grew up in the punk scene in LA. I was there right at the beginning, and I know that it was naive to think that we were going to change the world and the record business would be totally different, stuff like that. But that's how we felt at that time. And in this movie, I saw that same thing. So there's a lot of naivety there because the music business always grabs hold of everything and forces it in some aspects to conform to what they want it to be.
Yeah, can you expand on that? What you're talking about, the idea of how it was going to change the music business. I mean, obviously, music, rock, everyone is always trying to change the world at some point. But what about changing the music business? What was it, and what were you guys trying to change?
Well, everything was at that time, prog rock was really popular. And I have to admit that I was a big prog rock fan too. But, even I, being a prog rock fan, started wondering about the whole business of putting out an album like Yes did with Topographic Oceans. It's one song that takes four sides of a record, and it just got ridiculous. And it got to the point where people couldn't, you had to be like a master musician to play this type of music. And what we were trying to do is bring it back down to the people and garage bands like in the 60s and stuff like that, and allow the kids to be able to play the music again and be part of it, and the audience, keeping the audience and the bands pretty much as close together as possible.
So let's go to the beginning because I just jumped right in without giving you guys your proper intros. Why don't you guys tell our listeners about your involvement in the punk scene? I know, Skip, you told me you guys have seen over 2,000 punk shows, which is pretty amazing. But you guys were there and part of the scene beyond fans, obviously. ML, you manage bands, you guys work with bands. Tell us all about that, you guys.
Well, I was working at a record store in LA called Licorice Pizza, except I was actually down in Orange County when it all started. And so when the punk thing started, I was right on top of it. And it was exactly what I was looking for. I mean, in 1975, 74, 75, I got sick of the whole long hair bullshit and hippie shit. And can I say shit here?
So, yeah.
And then,
it's punk rock, ML.
Okay, yeah. And I one day I went home and I just shaved all my hair off, and I asked my dad for an old suit, and I showed up to work the next day wearing a suit and tie and my head shaved, and everybody was just totally freaked out. So when I saw, it was Patti Smith first. When I saw a picture of her, I went, okay, this is right on my wavelength, and so I started transitioning from prog rock to punk rock. So yeah, anyway, so when punk rock happened, I got right involved in it. I was in Orange County, but I'd go up to LA all the time, and I was managing a band called the Furies, who were more of a pop band, but were part of that punk scene. The second band I managed was the Zeros, who were totally into the punk thing. So I was involved with it from the very beginning. Knew a lot of those people, knew a lot of the bands. To the point of where like I got beat up outside the Whiskey once, and the Go-Go's came to me and said, "You show us those people, and we're going to kick their asses." So I knew all these people like that. So it was a lot of fun for the few years it lasted.
And I want to come back to some of that because I know you've told me that story, and I want to get into that. But Skip, tell us your background in the punk rock scene.
So he also left out that he was also involved in the Mask, which was the very first punk club in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. It had two variations. It was the initial one under the Pussycat Theater in the basement, which is now World of Wonder, and they still have the basement with all the scrawlings, all the graffiti, which is really great. They need to make it into a museum. Then there was a second Mask, which was later on Santa Monica Boulevard, and then when it closed, that's where I call myself a second gen, because he was at the original Mask. I never got to go into the original Mask. I was too afraid to leave my house at the time. I was very, very different person. I was very shy and introverted. So I was pretty much an observer from afar. So in 1976, I was buying records for a collectible artist, for a very popular artist in the world. And in 76, I was using magazines to look for collectibles when I saw a picture in Trouser Press, which was a American magazine for English rock, which covered Rod Stewart and things like that. And in this magazine was pictures of the very first pictures of the Sex Pistols, and not even the Clash, just the Sex Pistols. I was immediately intrigued, started buying the records immediately in 76, got into Ian Dury, got into all of it, all by using records, but never going out to shows until November 77, when I went to my first club show, which was Elvis Costello at the Whiskey. So from that point forward, I got more and more going out to shows. So in 78, I really concentrated on going out by myself more and more. until I met him in around in May of '79 at Licorice Pizza in Pasadena, and I started hanging out with him pretty much around then, maybe a little later from that point forward.
And you both have mentioned the Power of the Press magazine, right? So you both kind of like Skip, you got into punk music before necessarily hearing it. You saw the pictures of him, how important, I mean, and they touch on it in the movie, but necessarily I feel like they don't get into it as much as they should. How important was the alternative and punk press to that scene?
Extremely important, because the mainstream press wasn't writing about it. The newspaper. Actually, I'll take that back a little bit. The L.A. Times, Robert Helburn was the music writer that, I mean, he would venture into the. I don't know if he ever went to the Mass, but he would, when the Whiskey and stuff started booking the bands, he started venturing in and doing reviews of them. But on the whole, the mainstream press wasn't covering it, so the kids needed to start their own press. So Slash magazine and Trouser Press was around before because they were covering the '60s scene, but they were still a small magazine. They clamped onto it, and that's where we found out about a lot of bands, especially the English bands, because there was no other way to find out about them except through these small press magazines, rock and roll magazines, and the ones that were coming over from England. Sniffing Glue was coming over from England, and if you go to the right record store, you could find these things.
Even Enemy Sounds and Music and Melody Maker later were starting to really talk about all these bands extensively. That's when everybody over in England's like, oh, it's over, because everybody's finding out about it because it's an international press. And I remember him going to Coanga newsstand in Hollywood and picking up the newest Enemy, the newest Sounds, the newest Melody Maker every week to read up on certain bands and stuff, because you could get information that way too. Again, there was no internet. This was it. It was just print.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like, with the internet, Dave and I are probably the last generation of like video store and record store, right? So in a way, when you have everything at your fingertips, you don't necessarily have to research everything and go deep dive and find that passion. So people might have a little more surface level appreciation, but if you guys latched onto something before that, you really, and you guys are real examples of it, you really kind of ingratiated and ingrained yourself into the culture.
Yeah, I bought, at the time, because especially since I worked in a record store, I bought every punk record that came out, for a couple of years there. Sometimes Licorice Pizza was a chain, so we got some things. I would help try to find things, but a lot of times I'd have to drive up to Long Beach to a record store called Zed Records, which brought all the punk rock stuff in. And so I'd go there once a week and pick up all the newest stuff that I could get. And most of that I found out through Melody Maker or Sounds or NME. And but the weird thing was, despite all that and keeping track of it and buying it all, I still to this day find someone will mention a punk band. I'm reading a bunch of books about the whole English music scene, starting with punk and now going into post-punk. But they'll mention bands that I'm like, I had no idea, So I don't know how I missed them, but I managed to miss them. And some of them are amazing. I go back and I go and listen to them online, and because everything's online. So
it's rare for Mel not to know something, because literally he just dumped into his brain every single solitary thing at the record stores, whether hearing it for free by playing it on the phonograph when it was in the store or whatever. And also, I picked up like my first Damn single. I picked up at it just left my brain. I can't remember it, but Music Plus even carried it. All these singles and albums. And Tower, yeah. Tower's where I bought my first Damn single, and they were even doing it. And they had this huge store, and they would have a small little like roll around like singles tree to let you pick from for the few things that were coming over. Stiff heavily blanketed LA with all their singles, that's for sure. All their artists, which was Costello and the Damned and Lena Lovitch and all that stuff.
He said something that reminded me to go back to the movie, that this is, the Punkin' London movie. I was very surprised because he talked about getting the first Damned single. I was very surprised that there was no mention of the Damned in the movie at all. Because they, to me, were more than, I mean, I love the Clash, at least especially the early Clash, and and the Sex Pistols were really good. But the Damned to me summed up the whole punk scene in London almost, completely, and that they didn't mention them in this movie at all. Probably because they wouldn't have anything to do with it, but
And also, they were the first UK punk band to play Los Angeles. They played the Starwood Club in early 1977. And after that show, that's when the punk scene in Los Angeles really started to explode.
The Damned played at the Starwood. They were supposed to be at the Whiskey opening for Television, and Television said, no, we don't want this band on the bill with us, so they booted them off. And so they hastily put together two nights at the Starwood, 2 shows a night. I went to all 4 shows. Hardly anybody was there. But the people that were there were the people who, after that show, said, okay, we're forming a band. We're going to be punk bands. And that's when the LA punk scene really took off.
It's similar to all the UK punk scene, the Ramones or the Sex Pistols, and going, okay, I'm going to do my own band too. It's a similar kind of influence.
Yeah, talking about the movie, I was going to bring that up because, Miles Copeland, you mentioned Sniff and Glue. He talks about how there's only 2 towns in the world where there's like a vital scene, and it's New York and London. And I know, obviously, the movie's Punk in London, but I was surprised that we didn't get anything of like the Ramones going over to London or Iggy or anything like that, even the proto-punkers. So, that kind of idea, they talk a little about how Birmingham is 150 miles away and it seeps into London and vice versa. But really, I thought there would be a little more connection between the New York and London scenes. I know you guys, got over there in 79, 80, 81. What about New York? Were you guys involved in that scene at all?
I went to New York, and what year did Elvis die? 77? I can't remember.
Yes.
And that's when I went. I went there because I was in New York when Elvis died, and the whole city closed down for a day. It was in mourning. But I went there in 77 and went to Max's and CBGB's and all the different clubs that were around at the time. Saw the Dead Boys, saw Johnny Thunder's Heartbreakers, a bunch of stuff. And so that's where I first got I mean, I was already Patti Smith and Television and the Talking Heads meant a hell of a lot to me. I mean, that was to me the beginning of punk. And so I was already into it. But when I went to New York, that's when I started meeting people. I ended up working with Lydia Lunch for 2 years and, doing things with her and stuff. So it was a big, going to New York was a big eye opener to me because it was growing up in LA. New York is a pretty weird place, especially back at that time, So it was very exciting.
Do you agree with Copeland that he was saying how London was about twice the wattage, twice the bandwidth, twice the encompassment of that scene, or did you feel like the New York and London scenes were on equal footing at this time?
I think they were on equal footing. The British like to go on and on about how they invented punk, and in some ways they invented a different type of punk. But I think punk started in New York. Maybe even if you really want to push it, punk started in Detroit with the Stooges and the MC5 and stuff. But the basic modern at the time punk scene, I think, was Patti Smith and the Ramones and Television stuff, and that was a good year or 2 before England started. It was basically the Ramones going over to England where everybody really, I mean, the Sex Pistols had already started. This book I'm reading, they were talking about the fact that all the bands were forming and they all sounded like Mott the Hoople. And then the Ramones came over and suddenly everybody was really fast. It was like Mott the Hoople really fast, which is funny because when the first Sex Pistols single came out, I played the B-side. I think it's Do You Know Wrong. I can't remember for sure. And I'm going, God, this sounds like Mott the Hoople, So, the connection was made, and Mott the Hoople turns out to be one of the biggest influences, according to these books, of all the punk scenes and punk bands in LA, in London anyway.
Skip, do you think, do you agree? Was it the MC5 and Iggy, or do we go back to the Kinks and the Who as the, how far back can we take this birth of punk music?
I I'm actually not as studied in the earlier stuff. I tell people my musical birth was really 76, even though I did see the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in 64 and remember it clearly at age 7. And my parents buying me the first Beatles record and being a Beatles fan and some rock and roll stuff up until 76. But for the most part, I never really paid much attention to anything other than what was being played on the radio as far as rock and roll was concerned. And then 76 came around and that just exploded my brain as far as wanting to learn everything I could about that scene going forward. Whereas Mel was going out all the time from 65, we are guessing seeing the Supremes at age 10, going all the way from there to going to shows with parents would drop him off at Anaheim, convention center and being able to see bands by himself and come out and get picked up again. So he was going to see a lot more shows than I was even aware of, bands I wasn't even aware of. I didn't know who Canned Heat was until I met Mel. I didn't know any of those like outliers to, for the hippies and stuff.
I really wasn't. I was into rock and roll a bit. And I, like he said, I went to see Iron Butterfly and bands like that, the ones that my father would drop me off to because I was too young to go to drive myself. But it wasn't until I moved to Washington, D.C., or actually to Springfield, Virginia in 70. And they had a public access television show there. And that show had people like Captain Beefheart and the Blues Image and Emmett Rhodes and Alice Cooper. And I had no idea about these bands until then. And at that point, I'd run down to the record store and start, went out and bought Troutmaster Replica, drove my parents crazy with it, and stuff like that. So that's when I first started finding out. And that also introduced me a lot to the underground, the garage band, late 60s garage band thing that was happening in America too.
Right. Which all kind of connects.
Yeah.
So in the movie, right, they're talking about how when punk started, it was supposed to be about tolerance and it didn't matter how you dressed and, who you were and what color you were. But you guys dealt with, ML, you told me a whole story about intolerance that you dealt with at a punk show. You guys met. Did you guys start dating right away or how did this work out?
I count our first date as being pretty much the yachts at the Whiskey early November 1979. Our first real date was Palladium Police in November. And then that's when he was talking about going to England in March of 80. So I went with him in March of 80 to London for 2 weeks. And during that period, that's when we became a couple. It was during that trip. But that's really our history as far as but I knew him from April through November because I would go into Licorice Pizza and ask for his opinion on records and stuff to buy. And he was giving me crazy things like pop group. And I was like, I have no idea what this is because I didn't have the budget that he had. He had an unlimited budget pretty much with his discounts and stuff. So.
Yeah, those sweet discounts. I used to work at the video store.
Yes.
And that was good stuff. But Skip and ML, you were telling me you were at a show and when you were talking about the Go-Go's, right? You were beaten up or attacked simply because of your sexuality, right?
Well, that's what it turned into. It started with this girl. This was about the time that punk. Everybody started getting bored of punk.
December 79.
Yeah, this was 79, the end of 79, because all the kids were coming from the suburbs and from the beach, and they had seen that punk was violent on TV, so they thought they had to be violent to be punk. So this girl kept coming up behind me and kicking me really hard on the back of my legs and then running away. So I finally saw her coming and I turned around and just clocked her one. And at that point, all her friends came over. And so the club kicked all them out because the club knew me. This was the Whiskey. Yes. The security knew me. But when I went outside, they were all waiting. And one of them said, "What's wrong? Don't you like girls?" And I said, "Well, not particularly." And that's what all hell broke loose. So it was, there was, when the punk scene first started, that type of intolerance wasn't around. You had people of all colors. You had people of all sexual genre, whatever genres. There half of the LA scene was gay, and it wasn't until all these kids started coming in from the suburbs who didn't really know what punk was, and that's what also when it changed to the 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 thing,
and the surf punk thing, the beach punks. Yeah, that's the thing I liked about the scene, is that it was very tolerant, and I didn't even identify as being gay for myself. I was kind of like, I didn't know exactly what I was. I just didn't really have any interest, and went to shows and I went by myself, and I'm like running into people and making friends, and it was like, every color, blacks, brown, white, yellow, every single thing you would ever want in a scene. And they were all really cool people. Oh my God. Like the alley cats, the awesome Asian woman on bass. Oh my God, she's incredible. And then there's this guy and a drummer. It was like, I'm like, oh, I'm just learning so much about, a completely different world than just generic, what rock and roll was being fed to you through the radio and stuff.
That more than anything, I know there's a movie, another movie called Women in Punk, but it doesn't get enough coverage to me. The fact that women were so prevalent in punk bands, and not just, but before that time, with a few exceptions like Fanny, women didn't play instruments; they just sang. But in the punk scene, almost every band had at least one woman who was a bass player or a drummer or a guitar player or something. And it was actually pretty amazing at the time, because you just didn't see that very often. Then you had then the Go-Go's came along doing everything, including writing their own songs, which again, at that point, about the only band I can think of that was actually doing that was Fanny. And most people didn't know who Fanny were. So
what did you guys, I mean, I think we're all kind of mixed on the movie. We all kind of feel like performances, some good ones, some, not as good ones. And then from a story standpoint, I felt like they just scratched the surface, but didn't really dig deep on anything there. So do you guys agree, disagree? And then to follow up, is there a different punk movie / documentary you would recommend to people who want to learn more?
Oh, that's a hard question.
I think we both agree with you that it didn't dig enough, but it was just a kind of like some Germans went to London and decided to try to film this thing while it was happening. It was good luck that they were able to do that, but they didn't cover the bands that would ultimately become like known. I mean, for instance, Susie and the Banshees is never mentioned once in the film, which is a real mistake on their part. But they only could get to the bands that they could get access to, is what I'm guessing. But the good thing about this movie is that it has footage I've never seen before, of bands I've never seen before, like the Killjoys with Kevin Rowland from Dexy's Midnight Runners. But he's not singing all a cappella. He's like doing punk rock. That was so great seeing him in that role, because I've never seen that footage ever. The Clash footage was amazing. It really was. Strummer it's just so insane. It was amazing to me. I love that piece, that part of it. So it had its ups and downs, but there's so many punk movies from that scene from the UK that are out that I noticed they were popping up on my Prime when I was using Prime to watch it, that you could watch them and just get a whole ton of different footage of different, perspectives of what was going on, which is great that anybody had the wherewithal to film all that. In LA, there wasn't enough filming that was being done.
There was the decline of Western civilization.
Right. But that came later. That's towards the end. That's like 79 was being filmed. So, but in the early days, nobody had the wherewithal to really film anything or pay attention to the scene, which is too bad, because there was a lot of stuff that was really amazing at the time.
As far as English films go, I can't think of any that were any better than this. I mean, if I would have saw this movie back when I was 25, I probably would have loved it. Instead, the naivety of people and stuff just comes more out to me now that I've grown older and know exactly what happened. But I did, like he said, I thought that the live footage in it was well worth watching the whole movie for, because it was great. You don't see enough of X-ray specs that hardly did anything and stuff like that. So
that was great.
It was great seeing bands like that.
My favorite documentary that came out of stuff from that period remains Erg, A Music War. There is such variety in it. It's from all over the world, and it's really, really good performances out of every act in that film. That's for me my favorite.
My recommendation would be Don Letz's Punk Attitude. Have you
That's
guys
a really
seen
good
that?
one. Yeah.
Yeah. But I want jumping back to Skip, one thing you were saying to me, I couldn't agree with you more. That footage of the clash in Munich just crackles, and you could see why they were so captivating, not just as a band, but also you could see they were already expanding, what you're talking about, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and going into reggae and different styles. And that's all from the first album, right? Which we kind of see later, really fully realized on, London Calling. But I thought that was, to me, the highlight of the movie.
And they did turn me on to reggae, just like Rodent said. Oh, those people never heard of reggae. I had never heard of reggae until I heard the Clash doing reggae covers and such. And then I meet Mel, and he's like, "Oh, I've known about reggae since '69." And I'm like, "See, I didn't have that that music education that he had gotten."
That first time I went to London in '79 for 5 weeks, I came back with my suitcase. I had to leave all my clothes behind except what I was wearing because I bought so many reggae albums because you couldn't find them in America at that time,
and singles.
And yeah, I had albums, and I was like pulling this really heavy suitcase with me. Fortunately, at that time the airlines weren't as strict about that type of thing, but but I had hundreds of reggae albums at the time that when I finally met him. But it's a great music. I still am a big fan.
I think if you watch like The Harder They Come, which, by the way, maybe the greatest soundtrack of all time, but that movie really kind of encapsulates what the attitude of punk rock became. And that was 72 in Jamaica. So you can really kind of, build that bridge right there.
Yeah,
that's true too. By the way, I entered the Ellen DeGeneres contest for 15 years, and finally Mel's phone rang because I entered both our email addresses, and it said, "You won our contest." And in the background, I'm screaming, "We're going to Jamaica. We're going to Jamaica." And we literally flew to Jamaica on Ellen DeGeneres' bill in 2018 or 17, either 2017 or 18. And all we did, we went to a 5-star resort. It's like a $1,000 a day resort. And the entire time, all the residents there thought we were crazy because we were constantly going out and going to Kingston to look at reggae stuff, going to Bob Marley's grave, Bob Marley's house. All we did the whole time we were there, instead of relaxing in a beautiful resort, was to go out and see as much reggae stuff we could get our hands on, and ran into a Rastafarian and talked to him about veganism. And he was going, "Who are you guys? How do you?" And I showed him my list of artists that we had seen. And he's like, "How the hell? I never even got to see these people." And it was like back in the early, the early 70s, the late 70s, early 80s and stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure you crushed me on that. I have seen Jimmy Cliff a couple of times, and he's a transcendent performer. What about, let's talk about the Teddy Boys, the rock and roll, quote unquote, purists who hate punk music. But it's weird to me because, Joe Strummer came from the 101ers and was really playing that kind of more rockabilly type stuff. So, when he saw the Sex Pistols, he was like, we got to change it all, right? So did you deal with kind of Teddy Boy types, or what's up with this, guys?
I never saw. I really can't. I mean, I might have seen him walking on the street, but I never had anything with him. In L.A., it was almost the same thing, except it was just the country western fans, the guys with cowboy hats and stuff,
and rockabilly.
And the rockabilly scene was really big in L.A. and crossed over with punk. So we had to deal with the cowboys who would, we went and saw. Who was it? We went and saw.
Waylon Jennings.
Merle Haggard. We went and saw Merle Haggard, and the club was on this side, on the right side was all these punk rockers. On the left side were all these cowboys, and everybody just stared at each other the whole time, but never mixed. It was like the weirdest thing. But both groups loved Merle Haggard.
And an example of Billy Zoom being from the rockabilly scene, joining X and creating that sound for them. It was perfect marriage. I mean, and we knew a lot of the rockabilly people back in that scene as well. And they did we did mix, like we saw the Blasters a number of times, and they were within that rockabilly like love fest as far as what those fans liked, and we would cross back and forth, and they would cross over to us too. In LA, it wasn't as much of an issue.
But to get back to your question, no, I never had any dealings with Teddy Boys. Had a lot of dealings with skinheads, but never with Teddy Boys.
Mm. Jumping two follow-ups, because in my mind when we're talking, I'm like Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, that whole outlaw movement is really akin to punk, So it's very strange to me that this, the separation, and I guess any movement at some point gets that intolerance. No, this is what it's supposed to be, instead of what the original core values were.
Yeah. Well, the early punk scene, all that stuff was all the kids liked that stuff. When the Clash saying no Beatles, Elvis, or the Rolling Stones, they didn't mean that you didn't listen to those bands. It just meant that they were the whole fandom and the whole thing had just gotten so out of control where you couldn't afford to go see these bands anymore and stuff. So that's what they were commenting on. They weren't commenting on liking this, because the Clash loved all three of those, But of course, that when when it broke, when punk really broke big again, the kids came in who didn't understand. They just assumed that you couldn't like that, you couldn't have long hair, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. And originally, punk was anything goes.
Today, are there punk bands that you would want people to kind of look at right now? What do you think of the punk scene today?
Well, again, my definition of punk is really different than other people. I mean, as far as 1, 2, the just the hardcore punk bands with the 1, 2, 3, 4 thing, I don't like many of them. I liked Off, Keith Morris's band, the Circle Jerks, who unfortunately just split up. I thought they were really good, but on the whole, I don't really like those type of bands. I like bands like some of the English bands like what's the one that you like so much is influenced by the Fall? There's a band called Shopping.
The lead singer girl band.
Yeah,
very influenced by the Fall.
Unfortunately, I can't remember right now, but
I'll tell you one LA.
Wet Leg?
Wet Leg, yes.
Wet Leg is one.
Yes.
That's one. But
I consider them a punk band. So
yeah.
There's another one that had a woman who was talking through the songs, and I can't remember the name of that band.
Yeah,
wasn't Shopping, wasn't Wet Leg. It was the other one.
Yeah, I can't remember.
But my favorite LA version is Flatworms. Flatworms are great. I don't know if they're still around.
They're still around.
They're a great band to follow. That's one of my favorites of the past.
We were lucky they actually played the Bunkhouse about 8 years ago, so we got to see them, because we don't get to see many of those bands here in Las Vegas anymore. So
yeah, it has died down. We used to have a more vibrant, Bunkhouse. You could see, Car Seat Headrest playing in there.
Yeah, we saw them too. Yeah, so
that was a good show. And speaking of Vegas, you guys I know frequent the punk rock museum out here. Do you think it does an adequate job of showcasing this scene that this movie is talking about, the punk in London scene?
My problem with the punk rock museum is that it's too scattered. Like you go through it, and most of the old stuff, you start off with just a little small section of the 60s and then go up, but then almost all of it is bands after 1980. And the bands before 1980, like, the Buzzcocks are in some weird area where I'm like, why aren't they in there with the English, punk scene? Why are they over here again? But, it's too scattered, and it needs to be more linear in thing. They also need to add things like there's absolutely no mention of women in rock. There's a lot of stuff that's just not mentioned there. They're aware of this. I've actually told them this myself. So, they claim that they're going to work. It's a work in progress, and I hope so. I hope it gets to be a point where I think that it's a really good museum. But right now, I think I'm glad it's there, but it's not quite what it should be.
I will have to comment, though, that a friend of ours went opening weekend, and they said it was really a mess. We went the first time about a year later, and I was actually surprised at how well it was put together even though it did have problems. It does have like where I could point to something and go, that doesn't belong here. But on the most part, I was actually very pleased with it. My first visit, as well as my second visit recently. I think it's a worthwhile thing, especially for kids coming in for punk rock bowling. If they want to go see the museum, I would suggest it because it has a lot of stuff was really interesting. So yeah, we're kind of split on this one. I would recommend it if people have the money and the time to do it.
I want to let you guys go. This has been a lot of fun, but we talked about that Clash segment in Munich. Were there any other performances you wanted to shout out in this movie?
X-Ray Specs was
X-Ray Specs. It was great to see the Lurkers. They don't get talked about enough. I can tell you a story about the Lurkers. I went when I went to in 1979. I took a bus to Peterborough, which is a city about an hour and a half north of London or so, and the Lurkers were playing because I wanted to see the Lurkers. And so they started playing, and about halfway through their set, the front doors opened and all these skinheads came in and started beating up all the kids. And so someone called the police, and the police came, and all the skinheads went out the back door, and the police came in and started beating up the kids that the skinheads are beating up. I'm running around with my passport out, going, "I'm an American, and that seemed to work because no one touched me. But it was just I had never seen anything like that in my life. It was just so the bus ride back to London was a very quiet one. Everybody was just the weirdest thing. But at least I got to see a half an hour of the Lurkers, and they were great.
Skip, you agree? Those are the ones that stand out here.
Yeah, and again, I'm blown away that I saw Kevin Rowland as a punk rocker. I think that's hilarious because I'm sure that's footage he would not want to be around. But it's just so great that you can show him starting out that way. I can't think of anything else in the movie that really struck me, though.
You know what? The movie, and this kind of goes to that next, really into the new wave, but it made me want to watch 24-Hour Party People again, right now.
Yeah, that's a great movie.
Yeah.
So, is there anything you guys want to plug? But I want to just, before that, I want to thank you for your expertise and your time and teaching us more about how not to get beat up in England when the cops come.
Not really that I can think of.
Well, the bands he represented were Thin White Rope, Poster Children, Congo Norvell, which had Kid Congo. What other? The Zeros,
the
Furies. You see any of those records? Walkabouts. Yeah. Buy those records. that's just to help our friends.
All right, and then we'll have to see where Dave Wakeland is playing in a club show. I love his club shows when he does the punk rock bowling sideshows. So maybe we'll catch a version of the English beat and general public and all that fun stuff.
Yeah,
he's always playing.
Yeah,
yeah, he loves it. So thank you guys so much. And one more time, ML Compton, Skip King. Punks in America here in Las Vegas.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.